So normally here on Game Explained, you'd expect us to review games. But this time we have something a little bit different, because we've had an early copy now of Ask Iwata for a few weeks, which is a book that was originally published in Japan a couple of years ago, now finally translated into English, and it's super interesting. So what this book is basically a compilation of articles that Iwata wrote himself for a website owned by Hobonichi, a company in Japan, and this book basically recompiles them, re-edits them into a more digestible format, for the book, while bringing in elements from the Iwata Ask series of articles as well. And this is basically the first time most of this has been officially translated into English. So there's a lot to go over here, and to cover it all, I have my good friend and fellow game explainer Tom here, who's also read the book, and we're gonna have a little review conversation, Siskel and Ebert style, about Ask Iwata. So Tom, let's start off with your overall thoughts on this book. What did you think of it?
I've read it twice, and I found there were a lot of details in there I didn't know about Iwata, which was unique, and it's not just necessarily about Iwata. If you're reading this book, you'll take away a lot of things about business and just treating people in general that are like good ways to go about living life.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, the interesting thing about this book is it's kind of less about Iwata himself as it is more about his philosophies of running a business and how to relate to people, and just the things like he learned over the course of his life that he used and how he used that knowledge to run these companies. And it's actually pretty insightful. Like, I can see myself taking lessons away from this book, as some of them resonated with me, and deploying them with running my own company. And yeah, it's just a really like interesting book that I think if you're like looking into it specifically like for behind the scenes details of Nintendo, you're gonna be a little bit disappointed, or even Iwata himself, although there are elements of both of those. But it really dives more into like his mindset and like why he does things the way he does. And the really interesting thing about this, Tom, is, as I'm sure you remember, in the foreword it mentions that Iwata didn't even want to have a book about himself. He had offers over the years and he turned them all down, and yet here we are with a book about him. But it was done with the blessing of his wife, and they think that even though they may have taken liberties in making this book, or rather in the decision to make the book, they think that Iwata would have been happy with it. Because one of the key players of this book was, of course, Satoru Itoi, the creator of Earthbound, who also created the company that ran these articles that Iwata wrote himself. And this is the figure that pops up throughout the book frequently, as they were not only great friends, but they collaborated with each other on these articles in game development, such as with Earthbound. And it's just really interesting how this book came together as a result of this. So this book, if you didn't realize like what went into it, and that it's really just a compilation of writings from Iwata and Iwata Asks, you would almost think it was entirely written to be a book originally. I don't know, did you have that same impression?
Yeah, because it's, all the chapters there, they make sense in their ordering. You got neat words of wisdom at the end of each chapter. It doesn't feel very disjointed at all. It feels like a very cohesive piece for the most part.
It really does. Like, even the words of wisdom, as you mentioned, like tend to tie into the themes of the chapter, and were kind of fun to read. Like, they acted as a summary and also kind of gave you a little bit more insight into things that may not fit into the text otherwise. And kind of to that point, like, this is a really quick read. Like, I sat down in the afternoon and basically had it done in 3 to 4 hours, and you've read it twice.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's not long. Maybe that's good in a way to be short and sweet. And also thinking about it as like almost like a metaphor. In a sad way, it also reflects on Iwata's life. It wasn't entirely too long, as he passed away around the age of 55. But yeah, he got tons of stuff done during his life, as seen in this book.
Yeah, he did. I mean, this book, again, it doesn't really provide a point-by-point of Iwata's life, though it does cover elements of it, including how he got started making games, how he ended up at HAL Laboratories and got promoted to president, while the company was in major financial trouble. Then he went on to Nintendo. But it kind of uses those more as a vehicle to provide the lessons that he learned, or how he made it through those troubling times. And that's where the real insight of the book comes into play. Though, as you kind of touched on, there are parts of the book that are surprisingly touching as well, especially toward the end, because the final chapter, or the penultimate chapter of the book, is both Itoi's and Miyamoto's remembrance of Iwata. And that's where like the book actually hit me hard. And like I almost shed a couple of tears during that segment, where I'm like, oh man, that's that's rough. Like, what really hit me hard is when Miyamoto mentioned how he had no one to bounce his ideas off of now. Like, that's something they used to do constantly, and that's when it hit him. Like, I have no one to tell these ideas to or my thoughts to, and I'm like, oh, that hurts. So
yeah, I think that's where the book hit me the hardest too. At the point where Miyamoto's like, my friend is gone now, basically, and there's like a hole in his life where he misses him and his Monday lunches for 20 years apparently.
Yeah, exactly. 20 years of splitting the bill, having these lunches, and even though obviously we can't relate on the same level as someone who knew Iwata like Miyamoto or Itoi, like I still feel like it's something that registers or will register for a lot of people reading it, because it's, for many of us, if you're a Nintendo fan, like Iwata was the face of Nintendo. Like, it's someone that we grew up alongside, to the point where, Tom, you and I were at, I believe, his first E3 speeches, which he kind of touches on in the book, where he mentioned that he realized he had to be the one to give some of these presentations in English, and how he was a little bit nervous or apprehensive of doing it, but because he knew he had to do it, he embraced the mindset of being positive. He's like, well, I have to do it, so let me figure out how to make that happen. And that's such like a heartwarming like lesson to take away. Like, he didn't let his fears or nervousness get the best of him. He just buckled down and got it done. And as I was saying, as one who grew up in Nintendo, or with Iwata, in Nintendo and Iwata, like, it really did kind of like hit hard hearing about some of the takeaways that people who have worked with him have had. Even like at the end of the book, like his son even mentions how he was a great father, and the author the author of that particular piece commented on that's not something you often hear in Japan. So
yeah, quickly, I could give you a story about my father-in-law, but yeah, I can verify that is correct. My father-in-law is Japanese. So.
right, yeah. So yeah, there you go. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot covered in this book, but if you are really looking for like some of that like deeper, heartfelt, touching moments, there isn't a ton of it here. Like, it does hit hard near the end, but by and large, it's more about his philosophy of running a business and things of that nature. So
that's probably good in a way. I don't think I'd want to be sad like that through the entire book. I'd like to learn these lessons, think of the happy memories that he had, and go from there. I couldn't be sad the entire time.
Exactly. I mean, Iwata was a very happy person, and one of the lessons that keeps coming around in the book is that, like, his goal was to make people smile. And it's easy to kind of like take a cynical look of that if you aren't too familiar with Iwata. But like, after like being exposed to him all these years and like reading his words in this book, I was like, yeah, I totally get that. Like, he really only cared about really making people happy and making people smile, and that came through in his leadership. Where, going by what he says in the book, like, one of the things he wanted to do was, like, some of the things he tried to do was, like, he tried to engage with people. He wanted to listen to people, to the point where he interviewed every person who worked at the companies he's worked at, or the developers of the companies he worked at, including HAL and the Nintendo, twice a year. And I believe, what was it, like 90 people or 100 to 200 people at Nintendo?
Yeah, well, it's like 90 people at HAL, like, in its heyday, and at Nintendo, he would interview maybe 40 executives and like somewhere around 140, 160 other people, like close to 200.
Right, like a couple times a year, he wanted to find out what they thought, and he would open every interview with, "Are you happy with what you're doing?" He wanted to know like how they were doing and how they felt, working at the company, and based on that, that would kind of direct the whole interview and what they would discuss. And there weren't any time limits for the interviews. Like, some were as brief as 20 minutes, some went on for 3 hours, and I think that's kind of like what probably eventually led to Iwata Asks, where where they essentially began to publish what some of those interviews.
Yeah, and what helps with Iwata too is that he was a game developer, and a game developer at heart, as he said in his speech, or a gamer, I should say. But yeah, there you go. There's a quote right there. In his mind, he's a game developer, but in his heart, he's a gamer. And that helped him understand people and sort of feel what they're going through later on when he became an executive. Yeah,
exactly. He had the level of insight that most CEOs or presidents don't have, and that is what's so unique about him. That's why I think the ending of this book really does hit hard, because it kind of makes you think we may never have someone like Iwata again. He had a level of insight that is so rare, and being able to run the company with it that cares about people as much as he did, while being able to emphasize with them and understand how they work and how to work alongside them. And one of the things I like about the book too is how it dives into some of those programming challenges that Iwata had himself, like how he effectively saved Earthbound. Apparently Earthbound, or Mother 2 as it was known in Japan, was having some major developmental issues, and when he came on board, he was a little concerned about stepping on anyone's toes, but he basically explained, look, we can either restart the entire project and be done in 6 months, or we can work with what we have and it'll take 2 years. And they eventually went with this idea of just resetting everything and ended up finishing the game in I think what was about a year. So half the time it would have taken otherwise. And that was kind of like another, a fun lesson to learn, that Wada kind of just went in, flipped the tea table in a very nice way, and made things possible.
Yeah, I think he later explained he actually only wanted the 6-month option, but he wanted to give everybody a choice, and as you said, not step on their toes, sort of come in as a newcomer, and also he created tools while doing this that empowered all the team to make it feel like everyone could contribute. So that was the type of person Iwata was.
Exactly. And I think it's experiences like those that apparently gave birth to what is apparently a fairly well-known quote of Iwata's, which is that programmers should never say no. And he goes into greater context or greater depth of what that means. But basically he's saying, unless it is literally impossible, you better not say no. What he's really getting at is, if you accept that it's impossible or accept that it can't be done, you're closing yourself off to other ways that it could possibly be done. And so he worked with people, over the years of trying to get them to think a bit outside the box and make it how the impossible can be possible, and I think it's through things like working on Earthbound that lesson became apparent to him.
Yeah, he goes on to say basically, or I think at the very end, Itoi basically says how Iwata thought, and that giving an opportunity for the game designer and team to have their vision come to life. Thinking about it, Iwata also says, you don't have to say yes necessarily, but you shouldn't just say no right away. You have to weigh the different pros and cons to having a feature in, but you should have an open mind.
Exactly. I think one of the more interesting lessons that Iwata kept circling back to is that success can lead to complacency. Basically, what he didn't want to do was having Nintendo rest on their laurels because, say the Wii or DS was doing well, they didn't have to worry or think about too much of what they had, what to do next that was interesting. And we've seen this with multiple companies over the years, even in the game industry, where they stop innovating because what they're doing now is working in the moment, and as Iwata said himself, you can lose, fans may just fade away if you don't continue to push yourself. And Iwata was constantly pondering essentially the meaning of Nintendo, what is Nintendo? And I don't know if he ever fully arrived at an answer, but that's something he kept asking himself to kind of keep himself, I think, focused on what it is that the company should do next.
Yeah, he said in a way you can have an ever-pressing list of tasks, but sometimes you have to choose one key focus and shift outside of those. And part of this kind of goes to the creation of the DS, where the former president, Yamauchi, told them to make something with 2 screens, but maybe that was more of a metaphor.
Iwata read that as a metaphor, right?
Yeah, he read that as a metaphor, but in the end, Iwata and Miyamoto kind of came to that conclusion, actually made something with 2 screens for the DS, which did astronomically well.
Yeah, I love the idea that they thought Yamauchi was speaking in metaphor. Maybe he was, but in any case, what he said ended up being an actual literal product that exists with 2 screens. It seemed wild at the time, and of course ended up being a massive success for them. And as you were suggesting, that really speaks to the point of, Nintendo always trying to do something new. And you also brought up the point that Iwata commented on that it's important to have focus. You have an endless list of things that you can do, but without focus, you're never going to get to the things that actually matter. And this kind of ties into another point that Iwata was touching on back when he became president of HAL Laboratory, when they were having major financial issues, as we mentioned, and that he said it felt a little bit like repairing a plane that is flying in the air. He's trying to keep this plane in the air while trying to fix the holes in it,
Yeah, definitely quite a challenge there with the amount of debt HAL Laboratory had, and to try to be taken seriously by other people. You're very young, in your 30s, president of a major company with 1.5 billion yen, which of course is yen but not dollars, but still a lot of money. I would not want to be in that much debt.
No, and this again provides like some insight that I didn't know about Iwata, where it does talk about like some of his experience with like becoming a president of a company at a relatively young age at the time, for a company that was by and large kind of failing at that point, and he had to figure out how to save it, kind of like how he saved Earthbound as well. And it's elements like that I think both provide a window into Iwata's insight, as well as giving us something we might be able to take away. Like a few other things that Iwata had touched on is that like he thinks we'd all be happier without regret, and basically I think what he's saying is that he doesn't think that we should regret the things we may or may not have done, but rather just treat them as like stepping stones to how we want to be in the future, or treat them as lessons for how we are going to carry ourselves moving forward.
Yeah, he definitely, like for the Wii, he said he wouldn't do anything differently, but that was extremely successful. But he all looks at things of learning and moving forward, and it sounds like in a way keeping that in with the editors is a way to say Iwata, definitely lived a full and great life and was satisfied at the end. He wasn't like, I don't think he would have had any regrets when he was in the hospital, though he was still working on games apparently in his hospital bed to the leading days up until his death, which is just all the passion he had. It goes to show.
Mm-hmm. So did anything else stand out to you about the book, Tom? Like, did anything surprise you about it, or that you found particularly insightful beyond what we may have discussed already?
Well, I know one of the big things is they kind of say Iwata is humble and modest, and it kind of goes through because he talks about Miyamoto in a way where Miyamoto would say they talk about a problem, and then later Miyamoto would call him and say, Iwata, I got it, or like on their lunch on Monday. But when you hear Miyamoto's words about Iwata would do the same thing to figuring out Miyamoto's problems. So it's like Iwata didn't want to do that, and Iwata being like the #1 fan of Miyamoto, but Miyamoto saying Iwata would always try to continue learning, test out theories, and be good at different things. Miyamoto would kind of get annoyed. He's like, stop trying to be great at everything already. But he was a real leader in that regard. But just with the book itself, I would say it's not necessarily a definitive know everything about Iwata's life. Like, it kind of skips out a lot of Wii U and 3DS. It's not a lot of him working with Sakurai. I mean, that part's very short. Even though, obviously they would be close.
Yeah, real quick, I did find that interesting that basically him and Sakurai did the prototype for Smash Brothers on 64 all by themselves.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Like, calling it almost like an indie game.
Yeah, the ultimate indie game is what they called in the book.
Yeah, and at that time, he would have been very busy. He would have been either president of HAL or moving on to Nintendo, like somewhere in that range. Or no, he would be president of HAL. And he would be working on it on weekends to help create this prototype with Sakurai. And they kind of knew they had something special in their hands. Mm-hmm. But with this, I guess maybe it's like the main bulk of the lessons they felt like they could take away, or just maybe maybe at that point with the Wii U and 3DS, they didn't have as many editorials with him at that time. So definitely, if you do want to know more about Iwata, like there's more there. It could be the modest aspect of like not bragging. Like they don't mention how he took a pay cut when Nintendo was doing badly around 2012. I don't know if that means the editor just kind of want to keep Iwata in the best light possible, but it would have been interesting to hear about how Iwata dealt with things during a tough era for Nintendo.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's perhaps one of the problems with this book is it just doesn't cover everything. And that's partially why it's such a quick read, is because everything, it's all killer, no filler, basically. It is very engaging, but it does skip a lot of things happening. And it's partially because they're limited to what Iwata wrote. Like they are only using his words on the website and from Iwata Asks, and so that's of limited reach. I don't think Iwata probably ever wrote about himself taking a pay cut at Nintendo, because he said he's a fairly humble person. So it would have been nice, or I suppose I would love to see. I would love to have read more about aspects of Iwata that he didn't touch on himself, because as you said, they barely even touch on the Wii U and 3DS eras. There's a little bit more focus on the Wii and DS, but even then just slightly. Like, once again, this really isn't a book about Nintendo. I mean, while Iwata, while everything he says pertains to Nintendo and his time in Nintendo, it's not really about Nintendo itself. And there are a few interesting facts in there, which we'll have a separate video about, I believe, covering some of those more interesting factoids from behind-the-scenes details of developing games. But by and large, this really is more about how Iwata operates as a person. And in that sense, like, as long as you know what you're going into or getting yourself into, it's really interesting. And especially because I didn't expect to take away lessons myself for how I might conduct myself in the future, or how to keep things in mind, just in general, that I hadn't really considered as much before. And it's like, wow, this is a person who's who gathered a lot of insight, both naturally through working, but also very purposefully. Like, the book itself covers how Iwata would read a lot. Iwata was always reading, I think, like management style books and things of that nature. And one of the things too is that Iwata had like an intense curiosity, to the point where he mentioned he would read encyclopedias like cover to cover as a kid, because he just wanted to know how things worked, and he wanted to like understand how things like connected together. It's almost like he treated life as a puzzle. He's trying to see how it fit, how everything just kind of works.
Well, that's like the title of the book, or the title of the book is Ask Iwata, but I guess like his series, Iwata Asks, and these are some of the answers he came up with along the way that we can kind of take and use for our own.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's almost like we're asking Iwata ourselves for advice, and he's happy to give it to us and putting a smile on our face in the process, which is all apparently Iwata wanted to do. So yeah, overall, I would say I like this book a lot. I think it's it's a quick read, perhaps a little too quick. It dives into some things or a lot of things I didn't even know about, even as they pertain to Nintendo, but especially as it pertains to Iwata and how he conducted himself and just his insight into business. I do wish again it had gone a little bit deeper in areas in which I covered topics that I kind of glossed over. And there are points in the book where this book assumes you have knowledge of Nintendo. Like it'll touch on games or systems or other elements of the company that if you're not familiar with them, it won't make much sense to you. And I wish they had provided maybe little like footnotes at the bottom of pages to better explain that. There was one instance where Iwata mentioned the latest Zelda game, and I'm like, which one is he talking about? Because there's no context as to what time period we're in at this point. I think they meant Twilight Princess, but I'm not entirely sure. So things of that nature to like help fill in those who may not have may not be fully up to date on their Nintendo knowledge would be useful. But overall, I think it's a good book. I would recommend it, and I liked it a lot. How about you, Tom?
I was a bit torn on what rating to give this book, because I was sort of in the same range as you, but I decided to go with loved, because while it doesn't have as much Nintendo facts and stuff in it, I feel like it's more valuable looking at kind of the life Iwata lived and, passing on those lessons that he learned for his memory. And, it is very touching towards the end too, hearing the kind of impact he had. And Iwata as a person at Nintendo, I kind of felt like get to know more and more over the years, and this is like kind of a pinnacle of it for me, even though he passed away a few years ago. I mean, I think it's a nice tribute to him, and as they say, it's all available online. This is convenient, single location to have the information easy. And I read it twice. I loved going through it. It never felt like, oh, I gotta stop reading. So that's always a big plus for me with the book as well.
And not just a convenient place to read it, a convenient place to read it, period, if you don't know Japanese.
Oh, yes. Don't trust Google Translate necessarily.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said. Like, yeah, it's a fun, engaging read that's more insightful than I expected. And it's great just to hear more from, someone that was around for most of our lives that is no longer. So it is nice. Like, it does kind of feel like a little bit of closure that we, may not have had as even just fans of Iwata and or of Nintendo and Iwata himself. So it sounds like we both recommend Ask Iwata. Real quick, Tom, to wrap it up, is there any part of the book or any like one element, like little story or anecdote or a little fact that stood out to you that we haven't touched on yet? Like any fun little detail you learned that you didn't know about before?
A fun detail for me is that Iwata brought in a treadmill into his office at Nintendo to do jogging and played Wii Fit constantly. I'm all for that, getting a bit of exercise in. So that was neat to Here, I don't see how you could pull it off, but sure.
My favorite, one of my favorite details was discovering that it was Iwata's idea to add Pokemon to Pokemon Snap.
Yeah.
Which is a key ingredient in hindsight. So my hat's off to Iwata on that genius insight. So
yeah, that's where he touched off on a lot of things, like including helping Pokemon around that time with like not just that game, but other games too.
So yeah, if you want to find out more about Iwata, definitely pick up Iwata Asks. It will give you some really interesting insight into the man himself, from the man himself largely, along with some beautiful words from Itoi and Mr. Miyamoto, or Mr. Itoi and Mr. Miyamoto themselves, that is just kind of like a lovely way to end this experience. So anyways, there you have it. Thank you so much for watching our review. If you liked what you saw, click that subscribe button, ring that bell, and let us know in the comments below whether you'll be picking up Ask Iwata yourselves. With that, we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.